For some of us, neurodivergence is a superpower that we can use to achieve things that other people have never done. For others, it's so crippling that it gets in the way of living our everyday life. How can neurodivergence be so disabling for some people and not for others? Let's find out. Before we get into this, if you don't know me already, my name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialising in growing the careers and the businesses of my fellow neurospices, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I'm someone who is neurodivergent neutral. I don't think of my neurodivergence as either a good or a bad thing. Some days it feels like a good thing, some days it feels like a really bad thing, and some days it's both. It's something that just is. It's a part of me, it's a part of who I am, and so it's something that I embrace, because otherwise, what's the alternative? I do find that a lot of the online and in-person discourse, if I'm honest, about neurodivergence from both neurotypicals and within our communities tends to be really quite negative actually. So I do find myself talking about more of the positive aspects to try and counteract that. I found it heartbreaking how many people give up on us when we are amazing, unique individuals in our own right. But I'm not here today to convince you that you should give your neurodivergence a bit more credit than you already do. I have other videos actually based around that topic. But instead, I want to look at the different modes and ways of viewing our neurodivergence. And at the end, I'm going to suggest a model that more widely represents the whole range and diversity of experiences that we have. Last week, I put out a video on neurotypicalness. And what does neurotypical actually mean if the whole concept of neurotypical is derived from being not neurodivergent? If you haven't done so already, I definitely recommend checking it out. You can find the link up here because it provides motivation for today's video. I left off with the idea that what if neurodiversity is just a natural part of life? What if our brains all just work in unique, different ways, and there's no need to stigmatise neurodivergence for being different because we all are part of that natural neurodiversity? But there is an issue with this way of thinking, because if we look at neurodivergence as just being a natural part of life and that society and cultural norms around it are what cause us to be stigmatised and struggle, then we might end up minimising the effects that it's having on people that are struggling a lot more with it than us. We might end up trivialising other people's hardships. This is something that I very much do not want to do. And in fact, when I first started to suspect that I might have ADHD, I actually stopped researching it because I didn't want to end up assuming and identifying with ADHD if I didn't actually have it. I was really worried about taking other people's experiences and minimising them or laying claim to something that wasn't mine. I want to make the world a more fair and balanced place. So how do I do that while acknowledging that some people do find their neurodivergence much harder than I find mine, but overall, even though it's hard, I'm overall neutral to it? In order to tackle this subject, we need to look at modes of disability and look into a bit more of a theory behind this world. For the rest of this video, I'll be referring to a book, Neurodiversity Studies, A New Critical Paradigm. In particular, I'm going to be referring to Chapter 4, Neurodiversity, Disability and Wellbeing by Robert Chapman. I'll be honest, this topic has been making me uneasy for a long time. I've struggled with aspects of imposter syndrome and questioning my own diagnosis because how can I be neutral to my ADHD when some people are really struggling with it and find it really hard? I support the idea of neurodivergence just being a difference and this being natural, but I really struggle with the feelings of minimising others' experiences. Researching this video has been a bit of a watershed moment for me in my own identity and got me to a place where I'm much more comfortable with my understanding of it. So in order to dive into the question of whether neurodivergence is a disability, we need to look into theories of disabilities. Let's get going. For the general population, the understanding of disability follows that of the medical model, which is also sometimes called the personal tragedy model. Disability here is framed as objectively bad. It's considered something to be pitied, a personal tragedy for both the individual and their family. This is also the framework that is used to understand disability from a medical perspective as well. In this particular case, it refers to conditions that deviate from the norm. We can also generalise this out to cognitive disability, including neurodivergence, which is often thought to be lower well-being and a lower capacity to flourish. Chapman pulls out a really heartbreaking quote. It comes from the paper, "Is a prevention and/or cure of autism a morally legitimate quest?" The quote says, "Even if the word suffering is not always used, much of the discourse in both academic and lay communities implicitly or explicitly relates to the relationship between autism and suffering, or autism and reduced well-being relative to a neurotypical norm. That implies there's an inherent association between autism and suffering in society in general." With this in mind, Chapman looks at exploring this new thinking around neurodivergence and asks the question, how much of this suffering is inherent in neurodivergence itself, and how much of that comes from society and cultural norms around us? Let's start by diving a little further into the medical model of disability, and specifically Christopher Borse's biostatistical model of health. According to Chapman, this is one of the most nuanced and robust models of dysfunction. And according to the DSM-5, dysfunction is the term that they actually use to describe mental disorders, so it seems like a reasonable place to start. Borse's medical model is built around the concept of function, that each organ or part of our body has some specific function that it's there to perform. The heart beats blood around the body, the lungs take in oxygen. Each of these things has their own function to perform. So with normal functioning in mind, we can tell if something is dysfunctional if it doesn't perform its normal function or deviates from the normal function by a certain distance. We call this standard functioning the reference class, and we use that as a comparison when evaluating individuals against it. The reference class should be uniform within itself, and we should also compare individuals to someone within the same age, species, gender, so that we're comparing it to a valid reference for that person. They need to be biostatistically similar. In this case, health is normal function and dysfunction is suboptimal functioning. And there are many ways in which this method makes sense. So Chapman's example is around balding. If a 6-year-old man starts to go bald, that would be considered normal in relation to the reference group, which is other 6-year-old human men. But if we see a 7-year-old little girl start balding, then that's deviating from the reference group, and so we might consider that to be dysfunction and something that needs treating. The power of this model is that it has built into it an objective measure of what is function and what is dysfunction, and no subjective judgments need to be made. So we can apply the same thing to cognitive function. There is a norm of executive functioning, so those of us with executive function challenges are deviating from this norm and therefore have a form of dysfunction. However, when it comes to something like neurodivergence, this has its limitations. For example, we can talk about the reference group. It kind of makes sense to compare people against people of the same gender, of the same species, of the same age group, but why not the same neurotype? What makes age, sex, and species more valid than neurotype or sexuality, for example? This is important because it defines who we consider dysfunctional or not. The majority of the population is heterosexual. So if you have a lesbian woman and you compare her against women of her age and her species, are you going to conclude that this woman is dysfunctional because she's a lesbian? I think we can all conclude that this is a social stance that is as ridiculous as it is offensive, but it proves a point that the biostatistical model has some limitations in this space. The other point is that the reference class needs to be uniform enough within its class so that deviations from it are significantly bigger than those within the class itself. With this in mind, there is some subjectivity in how we build the reference class, which means that the biostatistical model isn't quite as objective as it initially appears to be. So even without discussing the stigmatizing aspects of this model, we found ways in which this model isn't quite fit for purpose when you apply it to neurodivergence. This is where the social model of disability comes in. On a high level, this says that it's not the disability itself that is disabling the individual, but rather it's society. A person in a wheelchair is not inherently disabled by being in a wheelchair. They are disabled by the inaccessibility of buildings or the lack of ramps for them to get into buildings. It's not being in a wheelchair that's the problem, it's society that's the problem. But similar to the biostatistical model, this model is not without its criticisms as well. The first is that it has an inbuilt notion of impairment. The disabling aspects of society come about because this person has an impairment. But we need to be able to define impairment in order to make this model work. And to define something as impaired, there must be a concept of something that is not impaired, or a norm. Which takes us back to the exact same problem that we were just discussing in the biostatistical model of disability. The only difference between this notion of impairment and the notion of functioning versus dysfunctioning in the biostatistical model is where the source of disability is originating from. Is it originating from the condition in itself, or is it originating from society being disabling? Now, we could work around this completely by just removing the concept of impairment and saying that everything is a natural variation. But this leads us straight to the problem I was talking about earlier. If everything is variation, then we are minimizing the harm that people are actually receiving because of their condition. Instead, Chapman suggests looking at the work of Elizabeth Barnes and her value-neutral model of disability. So Barnes doesn't differentiate between impairment and disability. They're one and the same in this particular model. The disability in this case is made up of two aspects. One aspect that is inherent within the disability, and the other aspect is societal and cultural norms. The disability or impairment is made up of two aspects, one of which is societal, and the other which is differences in the way that we operate. In this theory, value neutral only affects well-being. So in a world without ableism, disability should be completely neutral, neither good nor bad. The important distinction in this model is the difference between local and global wellness. So something can be locally bad, so in a specific context, in a specific time, this can be bad, but globally it is neutral. Globally, it is not bad. This allows us to have the case where someone is struggling in their particular circumstances with a neurodivergence that someone else is finding to be not as much of a struggle. It is locally bad in one case, but globally, it's well-being neutral. This allows us to see both sides of the argument. A disability can be locally bad, like someone in a wheelchair not being able to access a building because there's no ramp for them to get in, without being globally bad. Being in a wheelchair as a whole is not bad in itself. The disability isn't what makes global well-being worse. It's the stigma and the marginalisation that does that. We can recognise that disability can be locally bad, and some people do really experience struggles with it, but disability in itself can be globally neutral. We can apply the same logic to neurodivergence, and in fact there are studies to support this. A 2006 study by Renty and Rogers about well-being in the autistic population found out that actually severity of the symptoms didn't matter as much to the well-being as whether the individual felt supported or not. It depended on the context, the locality, rather than autism as a whole being bad. Another study by Palmer and colleagues in 2014 looked at the schizophrenic population. They found that the happiness levels of schizophrenic patients correlated with psychological traits that had nothing to do with their schizophrenia. So whether the schizophrenic traits manifested as good or bad depended on other internal factors, such as how optimistic the person was. That explains why I can see my ADHD as neutral or even good at times, while others struggle with it a lot more. I do experience local bads with my ADHD, but I can believe that the unique circumstances that others find themselves in mean that they experience a whole lot more local bads, and our experiences don't contradict each other's. Neither do they contradict the global neutrality of our ADHD. This allows us to combine both sides of the argument into one. Yes, our neurodivergences exist, and in certain circumstances they are really challenging and make life a lot harder for us, but neurodivergence in itself isn't inherently globally bad, because it's a natural part of human diversity, and we are amazing diverse human beings in our own rights. And that concludes the examination of neurodivergence and models of disability. I'd be really curious to hear what you think on this topic. For me, I really like the value neutral model of disability because it allows me to feel much more comfortable with how I see my neurodivergence versus other people who struggle a lot more. But it might not be the philosophy that suits you, and as our understanding and views on neurodivergence grows, more models will come up to explain this in different ways. It'll be really interesting to see how our understanding of this topic changes over time. If you haven't seen it already, you might be interested in going back and watching my video on how my ADHD affects my personality. Leave me a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much for your attention.